I'm Rob Grimm of RGG Photo, and today I want to take some time to talk with you about natural light. As a food and beverage photographer, particularly a food photographer, natural light is kind of the hallmark of what we do. And it is so because it creates appetite appeal over any other type of lighting. So what is natural light? First of all, think about the sun. It is this direct source coming from a huge distance away and creating directional light. Now, it really doesn't create appetite appeal because it's pretty harsh. So I remember learning the term as a very young apprentice, open shade. Think of open shade as if you're under a shade tree, or better yet, if you're under a pavilion with a fairly high roof, but the sides are all open. And from those sides, from one side in particular where the sun is coming from, you have direction of light. It is pushing in on you, and it will create shadows. But those shadows are not harshly defined. They're not plugged up. They're not filled in. You actually see all the detail in those shadows, and they're soft. Thus, they're open. Open shade, that term that we use, is really the most appetizing when it comes to food photography. Today, I'm going to walk you through how I recreate natural light using strobes. Now, think about natural light throughout the course of a day or throughout the course of a year. It's constantly changing during the day, meaning shadows are moving. And throughout the seasons, it's constantly changing as well. That inconsistency does not bode well for me in creating images for my clients. They are going to need a family of images for their advertising campaigns, and they're going to need consistency. These are very important things for any food photographer to have in their arsenal if they're going to make it in the commercial world. Today, I'm going to be working with the Elinchrom ELC 500s. Now, this is a really nice monoblock because it works both in my studio and on location. It's really compact, but it's got a good amount of power, and more importantly, it has really clean light. The other thing I like about it are the Rotolux modifiers that I can put on the front of it. We're actually going to look at strip down, natural light, some mistakes that people make, all the way up to my final image and the final lighting that I craft or I recreate to make that kind of feeling of natural light. So why don't we go ahead and get behind the camera? I'm actually going to begin with you guys here on this image at the end. And that is the place where I feel like I've crafted the light and kind of gotten the image that I wanted. So let's first talk about what we're shooting here. Very simple in terms of a light environment and just getting a little hit of the cutting board and a fork and just kind of a feeling that there's some sociability because there's multiple pastries out there. Now, I've intentionally selected a very difficult thing to photograph. It is a shiny, glossy, round pastry. It's pretty much reflecting everything around me. So I'm using my diffusion, I'm using my set in order to kind of come in nice and tight and help create that natural light feel. What I'm doing here should be applicable to really any kind of food that you're shooting in order to kind of recreate that natural light. But as you can see, this is really glossy stuff. One of the things I'm also doing is I'm putting on a polarizer in order to control and kind of reshape my highlights. So I have made a move in the last couple of images where we're just switching the highlight on the polarizer a little bit. It's right on the edge there, and I rotated it slightly to kill some of that on the edge, and it's bringing a little bit more on the top. I think I actually like it going back on the side just a little bit. So I'm going to rotate my polarizer back to that, and then I'm going to do my final. And we're going to just walk through a couple other things. In terms of exposure, if you look at my curve here, that's a pure linear curve. I don't have anything on it. There's no adjustment, which means you've got all the room in the world in post-production to do stuff. But more importantly, you don't need to. This is a pretty solid image as is in terms of its exposure. I'm not relying on a bunch of curves or a bunch of trickery because one of the things I want to do too is maintain color rendition, right? So I'm maintaining that color. The second I put a curve on there, I'm affecting that color, and I don't want to have to go back and recorrect that. So for me, there's a big emphasis on actually creating good, natural feeling light that doesn't need a bunch of curves. Then I can just do a little fine tuning in post-production. So again, that is a nice linear curve. We've got some nice quality of light as it's coming across, and you can see that it's moving from left to right, and there's direction. One thing you have to remember, without shadow, there's no light. You have to have shadow, even on food photography where you're in so tight. Now again, I'm shooting with a macro lens because I want to be in nice and tight on the food, but I'm letting it go very soft, a very shallow depth of field, which is kind of one of my hallmarks, but it's also something that food photographers employ a lot of the time. One of the really nice things about this type of set is its simplicity. It's really just 2 lights, and my key light is doing almost the entirety of the lifting when it comes to actually creating the light. And it's a relatively small footprint. So this is something that you can clearly do in a studio. You can do this on location. Hell, you can do this in your dining room if this is what you need. Just, you know, a few feet of space. But let's kind of walk through the lights. So the key light is the monoblock with the Rotolux on it. Now this is kind of like a parabolic. This is nice and deep. And one of the things I like about that is it's giving it direction. And to me, I think about it in terms of, in some ways, it's like the sun. It's giving that nice direction coming towards me. And one of the things I've done with this is I've actually added a grid on the front of it. So that grid is helping to focus that light. If you think about the way the light is coming off of here, it's going to continue to go in the shape of that light, right? And it's kind of fanning out. Well, by putting that grid on there, I'm kind of focusing it in a little bit. I'm kind of containing that light. That's helping me bring direction to that food a little bit more than just having it kind of bleed out of the parabolic the way it normally would. But then I'm diffusing it. So in some ways it might kind of sound counterintuitive that I'm channeling this light, I'm chambering it down, but then again I'm diffusing it. But remember, you can do this type of thing with photography. You can use multiple modifiers in order to shape, in order to craft that light, and that's exactly what we're doing here. I'm taking a parabolic, which has nice direction. I'm using a grid to focus it a little bit more, and then the light that's coming out of that, I'm now diffusing to make it a little bit softer so we get into that open shade feel. Now here's one other thing I really want you to take a look at and really consider. I'm not using the entirety of this light at all. Look at the direction of this light. If you run a line, an imaginary line through the center of this light, it is going well over the food. Like the food is down here, it's nice and low. I'm using the bottom third of that light. That's it. The bottom third is going across that light. The rest of it is actually sweeping right on top of it, and it's hitting my diffusion going across. That in turn is coming back, and it's giving me a lot of fill. I think it's really important to use light, and even use a part of a light like this. This is something that a lot of portrait photographers use. They'll really feather a light so that just a little bit of the light is kind of coming onto the subject. That's what I'm doing here, but let's talk about this. The light that's inside of here, I'm just going to turn this towards you. The light that's inside, that flash tube, is sitting here and it's a sphere, right? It's a ball. And the light, when it's firing, it's going everywhere. It's going out in all directions. The modifier is shaping it and moving that light. Well, the light that's coming out of the top of that flash tube is coming up here and it's bouncing back down. So even when I'm using a bit of this side, I'm using the multiple of the light. It's kind of coming through, it's bouncing through that entire reflector, but I'm feathering it off. I'm just using this portion of it to really be my directive. That is one of the things that I want you to keep in mind when you're experimenting with this. It really helps bring a nice quality of light to just kind of use the feathered edge, to use a part of it rather than the whole thing. And that's one of the mistakes I really see young photographers in particular making. They just point the light right at the subject. That's not necessarily the most beautiful light. So let's talk about my diffusion. I've got 2 different types of diffusion, and I almost always have diffusion on my sets. One is a little bit thinner, and the other is a little bit more opaque. So I'm using the more opaque as my fill, my kind of bounce light. The thinner stuff I'm again using with my key light because I want to create that direction. I want to diffuse the light, I want to soften it, but I don't want to flatten it out. I don't want it to lose its shape, because remember, I need shadow. Shadow is really important to me. Now that light is coming across, it's hitting this, but it's not quite enough for a pure fill for my use, right? There are plenty of photographers that could do this or feel that they could do this with one light. You could have a bounce card over here, just use the one light and get that bouncing back. I like having a second light behind there that's very diffuse, and then I can really control the amount of light. And I'm talking sometimes fractions of a stop, 1/10 of a stop, just to give that shadow a little bit of kiss, because I want to control color and I want to control detail in those shadows. Last thing to talk about is the fill light. So I've got the ELC 500 with a Rotolux square softbox on the front. Clearly you can see the diffusion panel that's on the front of it, but I also have a diffusion baffle on the inside. That's helping to make the light nice and soft. And all of that is coming through my diffusion panel. So really and truly, I've got 3 sources of diffusion that are helping to knock down that light. All of that gives me the control that I want in order to make sure that I get good color rendition and good detail in the shadows. These shadows are really seen in just a couple places. When you look at the surface, we're seeing a little bit down by the fork, we're seeing a little bit of shadow. Now, I've intentionally maintained quite a bit of detail in that shadow right in front of the main pastry. You see it in front of the back pastries. And then I added just this little glass of cognac, which really doesn't mean anything to the composition other than it's giving it some color and some life, but it's also casting a really interesting shadow and hitting back. So I'm getting that sense of eye flow, not only with the quality of light that's coming, but with the quality of shadow. It's helping to move the eye through the composition. Well, let's take a look at kind of deconstructing this as we talked about early. Playing with shadow is something that you can do in order to really kind of find your own personal style and to make adjustments. You can make them longer, you can make them shorter, you can make them deeper. Let's first and foremost kill this light and just see how much the main light is doing on its own versus how much light we're getting through the fill light. I'm just going to go ahead and kick it off. And we'll do a new capture. The new image is on the right, and you can see just how much light was coming from that fill. Now, when you look at this, the properties of the main light are still there. I mean, they're kicking in, you've got the direction, but these shadows are really plugging up. Again, I don't feel like you can do really good natural light with just a single light source. I personally really believe that you need to have a fill kicking in there. We can go back and we can start to play with this and take away the diffusion, and you'll kind of see how that light degrades. It starts to get harder and harder and harder every time I do that. And remember, that is pretty heavy diffusion. It's a good amount knocking down that light. First and foremost, you can see the shape of the fill light. On my final hero, I've got a good amount of that highlight that's really broadening out. It's very soft. It's several inches here on the actual object. And here it's becoming much smaller. You get a much brighter highlight, very narrow, and that to me is starting to feel like a key light. So again, just putting a softbox in there, to me, it's not quite enough. And we can push that a little further. We could take off the front baffle. I'll pull a little power out because I'm gonna take a half stop out. Because as I do that, as I pull away these things, it's obviously drastically increasing the light. Okay, again, and you can see how it's getting harder and harder and harder in terms of the quality of light as we go. So let's go back and compare it to our final. You also can see how it's affecting other areas. It's not just this highlight here, it's in the shadows itself. You can see that they're getting a little poppy. And in some ways I don't mind some of that detail, but it's a little too much because it's becoming like a key light. It's now giving me that direction of a key light, and that's not what I want from my shadows, from my fill. So with just a couple quick moves on the fill light, you can see how that light's degrading. It's now becoming more of a directional source, it's becoming more of a key light, we're getting cross lighting, and it's kind of competing. But I do want to show you some changes that you can make or you can experiment with on the key light. In order to really see that, I'm going to put my fill light back to where it was, and then we can make some adjustments to the main. Okay, so let's take a look at the main light. Again, I'm using that lower third, right? I'm kind of feathering that. So let's first and foremost make the change where we just take the center of that light and point it dead at the subject. The changes here are pretty subtle because I'm just kind of tipping that down, but I definitely like the quality of light on my original image. Look mainly at the cutting board, particularly down here. You can see how this is nice and soft and that light is moving across. Here it's becoming much harder. You can also kind of see it in the highlights in back in that bokeh, but look right here in particular, all this stuff is just getting a little bit harsher. The main area on that pastry This side, it's starting to get a little bit too crispy. I don't like the highlights here, and all that's starting to pick up. And it's just a very simple change. But that simple change of tipping that down, directly pointing that light at it, is kind of affecting it. So again, I like to use that feather part just because I think it's a lot prettier. So let me further deconstruct this for you. I'm actually gonna pull this diffusion out of the way. I'm gonna roll it up, and let's just see what that Rotolux with the grid is doing on its own. It's gonna be far more direct, but I just want you to kind of see that property of light. Now, when we compare these two images, there's definitely a change in the quality of light. The one on the right is the new one, right, without the diffusion. And you can see that it is got a lot more direction. Particularly look at the top of the yellow pastry, look at the top of the main pastry in front. You can see that light kind of zooming in there. It's a little bit harsher. In some ways, you're getting a little bit extra texture as that light is kind of raking across, which to me on food, it could be good depending on the type of food, but here it's not. I'm starting to see too much of the surface. It's becoming a little bit bumpy, and I'm not loving that. I still am liking the one on the main. I think it's got the better quality of light, and I'm really doing it all in one shot. There's some nice properties of this, but overall, I'm still really enjoying the original image far more. So while I'm making you crazy with these subtle changes, I'm gonna make a couple more changes. One, we're just gonna pull the grid out so you can see how that light begins to kind of broaden out more with the actual shape of the parabolic versus having it kind of contained. Let's see how much power we might need to pull out of there because it's gonna be a little bit brighter. All right, so these are the last two images that I took. So clearly, I wanted to show you how much light that modifier, that grid was actually taking out. You can see it's changed the shape a little bit, but more importantly, it's changed the power outage. So let's compare this a little bit more fairly and get the exposure pretty much in sync. Okay, so I took a half stop out, and they're pretty close. They're within a comparative range that I'm pretty comfortable with. But what I want to do now is I want to really show you what happens when I move this light around. It's going to change quite drastically. So this is the mistake that I see photographers making with some regularity. Let's pull this up and do a comparison with just the last one. Look at the difference of that. So by bringing the light basically around the side, which a lot of times photographers are thinking about, window light kind of coming in from the side. By having it purely come from the side, we are losing so much of the quality of the shadow. Look, there's no shadow existing here in the foreground. There's nothing. It's just kind of raking across. You're getting awful shadows on the top. But again, you're not getting movement. Look at the image on the left. That shadow is kind of coming towards you, and you've got good movement. You've got good separation. Here, it's just blocking up. You've got hots, and then you've got these plugged up areas. The difference in moving the light was barely a few inches. Huge difference on the final, though. All right, the last image we'll take is comparing what was my favorite image with resetting the lights where they were, except bringing the key light around, because I want you to see how that shape really affects the overall image. Kind of kills it. Okay, the image on my left was the one that I liked the most. The image on the right is the exact same lighting setup, except I've moved the key around to the side. And you can see how much the image has degraded. Like this on the right, I think is a terrible image if you ask me. On the left, it's got a lot of interest, it's got a lot of appetite appeal, and it has shape and it has volume. Just look at the shape of the main pastry. To me, this one has volume. It feels larger, it feels more interactive. This one, number one, it doesn't look as good, but number two, look at the actual ellipse. It just feels like it's an odd shape now. And then finally, look at the nut on top. When I had the light coming from behind, I was getting good definition on the rim. You could see inside of the macadamia nut and really kind of understand what it is. But now that the lights come to the side, it's just completely blowing out and it's losing detail. So you can see how just a simple movement of a light can completely change the shape and the texture of what's in your image. So thanks for taking a look at this video today. I hope you got a sense of how simple it is to recreate natural light in a studio with really and truly just a couple lights. The Elinchrom monoblocks are fabulous and a couple modifiers, and I've got some nice properties of light. You might be wondering why I'm showing you these really kind of subtle changes. Well, I'm showing you those because it speaks to the believability of the quality of the light. You can't fix everything in post. These subtle changes really add up as you're working in camera and on set to make believable and approachable natural light. That, at the end of the day, is what I want for you.